It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome to our brilliant friends Daniele Luchetti, the director of the third season of HBO's My Brilliant Friend. Thank you for being with us, Daniele. And let's begin at the beginning. When did your work on My Brilliant Friend begin, and what were the first steps?
I primi passi sono di 6 anni fa in realtà, perché quando è uscito
Actually,
il
I
libro
approached this
Sei
project for the
stato
first
bravo,
time years ago.
io andai in
When the
casa
book came out
editrice
in
da
Italy
Ferri
6 or 7 years
e
ago,
dissi, guardate, se mai
I
si
went
farà
to
una
Sandro
serie TV,
Ferri, Elena
io
Ferrante's Italian
voglio
publisher,
fare
and
questo
told
libro e
him,
voglio fare la
look,
regia.
if this book is
E
ever
mi sa
adapted
che
for
ho
television,
scoperto che erano
I want to
tantissimi
be the
i
director.
colleghi
Later, I
italiani
learned
che
that
avevano
many
fatto la
other Italian
stessa
directors had
cosa,
made the exact
e
same
io risposi a
proposal.
Saverio chiedendogli se ha
Eventually,
fatto
Saverio
le
Costanzo was the one who prevailed.
bellissime prime
He
stagioni
directed the two
e
wonderful
poi per
first
l'artificio del
seasons and
personaggio si
then,
è
for personal
declassato,
reasons, decided to leave.
abbandonato la serie,
But it didn't
senza
abandon the
abbandonarla
series
totalmente,
completely.
perché
It
comunque ha
was one of the
seguito le
screenwriters for season
sceneggiature, i
3
copioni ed
and
è
was still
continuato a
involved
essere
in the
presente.
project. After Saverio
Poi
left, I was asked to direct this
Mi è
season,
stato proposto
which made me
di
very
entrare in
happy.
questa terza stagione e
Even
ne sono
though the
stato molto
third book
contento, anche
is
se
the most
il
difficult
terzo
to
libro in
adapt
realtà
of
è il
the
più difficile di
quartet
tutti
because of
quanti,
its
perché è
political
quello
themes and
in cui
some
ci sono dei
challenging
passaggi
narrative
politici un
elements.
po' ostici.
For example,
I
the main
personaggi
characters,
principali, cioè
Elena and
Elena e
Lila,
Lila,
are
sono
often
spesso
distant from one
distanti.
another. Also,
Il punto di
Elena's
vista
point of
di
view,
Elena, ad
which is
esempio, che
central in the book,
è centrale
acquires
nel
much greater
libro,
importance in the series too.
diventa più
When a
pesante
character in the book says something
nella
like,
serie.
then I
Perché tu
learned that
se
this or
tu hai
that had
conosciuto il
happened to Lila,
personaggio, che
as a
ti
reader,
colpisce,
of course, you can
poi
visualize
sai che
it.
Lila
But on the screen, you have to face the
come è
problem of how
stato
to
per te
represent
sul
it.
libro e come
You
vederla.
can't always show someone
Invece
telling
nel
a
film
story
ti
about
poni
someone
il problema
else.
di come rappresentarla questa cosa, non puoi
So
sempre vedere solo uno che
sometimes I
leva la
had to depart
bomba
from the
a qualcun
principle
altro, quindi a
of
volte
showing a single point of view
derogare al
and
tuo
also show the
punto di
point of view
vista
of other
un
characters.
po' per andare anche, come
My
dire,
approach was essentially to
sugli
work with the
altri.
script, which is extremely well
Il mio approccio è
written,
stato
but
essenzialmente
also to
quello
return time and
di
again to the book,
confrontarmi con dei copioni
because
molto ben
sometimes
scritti,
things had been
manipolare
left
anche
out or
continuamente il
summarized
linguaggio,
too much, maybe out of fear that the series would
perché
end
c'erano a
up
volte
being
delle
too long,
dimenticanze, a volte
and instead I
delle
thought these
sintesi che
elements should be
forse erano
included.
state fatte per paura di
Most
essere troppo lunghe,
important,
invece potevano
I
essere
had a long
recuperate.
correspondence with
E
Elena Ferrante
soprattutto c'è
herself,
stata
because I wanted to always make sure that I interpreted
corrispondenza
both the script and the
con la
book correctly.
Ferrante, perché
I have
volevo
to
essere
add,
sicuro
as a
appunto di
man,
interpretare bene
that being able
sia
to
la visione
benefit
che il
from the
libro.
perspective, the point of view of a
E devo dire
woman,
che
and especially of the woman
alcune
who wrote the
volte
book,
il
was
punto di
absolutely
vista
essential to me.
di una donna e
I
con
hope that the
questo libro
debates and
soprattutto
conversations
era
that
invece fondamentale.
develop between Elena Ferrante and me were
Sono stati
beneficial ones for
chiacchierati,
the
dibattiti
series.
abbastanza, spero, fruttuosi.
So you're a fan of the books. Can I ask you what struck you about the books when you first read them?
Io l'ho capito molto dopo, l'ho capito girando la
I
serie
understood
più
that
che
much later.
all'inizio.
I understood while shooting the
Essenzialmente il
series
fatto di
what
Lila
struck me at the beginning.
ed Elena
Essentially, it is the
sono due
fact that
facce
Leela and
di mia
Elena
madre.
are
Di mia
two
madre come di
faces of
tutte
my mother,
le donne
of
che
my
ho conosciuto nella mia
aunts,
infanzia.
and of the women I met in
Io
my
sono cresciuto
childhood.
in un rione
I grew up in a
molto
district of
simile
Rome, or rather, my mother grew up in a
cioè
district of
mia
Rome
madre è cresciuta in
that's
un
very
rione molto
similar
simile
to
a
the
quello
neighborhood in
di
Naples
Napoli
where
e
the series
del
takes
film,
place.
e mia madre
Like
non
Leela,
ha
my
mai
mother
avuto il
was not
permesso
allowed to study, and as a
di
result,
studiare,
she lived her whole life with the
quindi lei
feeling
ha
that
vissuto
if
tutta
she
la
had
vita questa
studied, she would have
sensazione che se avesse
lived a different
studiato sarebbe
life,
diventata
the
una
life
donna
she
diversa.
deserved. However, my father
D'altra
was an
parte
artist,
mio
an
padre invece
intellectual.
era
As a
regista,
result,
quindi
I was very
audiovisiale,
affected by the
e
explosive clash
quindi il
between
mix
Pietro's family and
successivo
Elena's
tra
family,
famiglia
that is,
paterna
between
e
the family
famiglia
of
materna, degli
intellectuals and the
intellettuali,
family of more
invece le
humble
persone più
people.
semplici,
But all of this
mi
affected
ha
me on an
molto
instinctive level.
coinvolto, ma mi ha
I've only
coinvolto
rationalized
di
this
più dal
feeling
punto di
very
vista
recently,
razionalizzata questa cosa
after
dopo
shooting the third season, my first
la prima
season.
serie.
Are there elements in the books that were difficult or even impossible to translate into the language of film, of television? What did you have to leave behind in the books?
Beh, devo dire che questo libro di averlo abbastanza sviscerato,
Yes,
abbastanza
although I have to
profondo.
say that I
Forse una
delved
parte
quite
che
deep into
avrei
the book.
allargato di
Maybe
più
something I
è
wish I could
costruire
have
che
expanded
Elena,
more is
nei
Elena's
primi anni di
loneliness during the
matrimonio,
early days of her
poi
marriage and when she starts to see other men, which is actually told very briefly in the book, and maybe the series could have investigated in greater detail and complexity. That was an interesting theme that I wish I could have expanded on a bit.
And vice versa, are there things that are more fully represented in the series than in the books, or aspects of the story that emerged more naturally in the language of TV and film?
Per esempio, io ho aggiunto così
For example, on my own initiative, I added some scenes that we could describe as hallucinations, where Elena's thoughts materialize on the screen, because I found it difficult to depict her feelings using traditional scenes with dialogue and acting. I wanted to render her thoughts visually, to depict her emotions, and this, in my opinion, is an addition of mine to the book, but one that serves to interpret the book more faithfully, not to depart from it. When I couldn't express the emotions of the book with actual scenes, I intervened more actively from a directing point of view, sometimes using light, sometimes music. I used all the tools I had at my disposal. I always started from the pages of the book every morning. I read them on set, we read them together. We tried to understand what we were representing. And often I realized that we needed something more than what was already written in the script.
You've directed many successful films, but unless I'm mistaken, this is your first experience directing a TV series. What was that experience like for you, and how was it different from directing a film?
La sensazione è quella di dover
It felt like I had become the captain of an ocean liner that was already halfway to its destination. I say an ocean liner because of the complexity of my brilliant friend, the multiplicity of elements it contains, in terms of production, of narrative, but also in terms of intellectual framework. I boarded this ship to make my own personal contribution to this intellectual archipelago. After all, it's the director who has the last word. At the same time, it was stimulating to have to work within the pre-existing conceptual architecture of the series, to carry its intellectual cargo. Sometimes I found myself with things that just worked, independently from me. And this surprised me because in my experience, when I direct, everything depends on me, even the things that go wrong. Instead, here I noticed things that worked perfectly precisely because they were already there. First and foremost, the cast is something that Saverio Costanzo put together, for which I deserve no credit, and that is truly remarkable. I directed this cast according to my taste. But again, it is like commanding a ship that has been entrusted to you. You can take it safely to port or crash it into the rocks. I hope I've managed to bring it to its destination satisfactorily.
Let's talk about Gaia and Margherita a little bit. Margherita Mazzucco and Gaia Girace, the two actors who play Lenou and Lila. They are extraordinary, magnetic, as are many of the other young actors who are part of this series. Can you tell us a little bit about working with those actors? And in particular, I think, how did you guide them in their interpretation of characters who are living at a period that is so distant from their own experience?
Io ho fatto con loro un lavoro di addestramento che è proprio il lavoro classico del metodo, cioè
I
quindi ho lavorato sul
worked with the
personaggio,
cast on
ho lavorato
method,
sui
on
sottotesti,
character,
ho
on the
lavorato
subtext.
sull'arco dei personaggi.
Part of the crew on set
Eravamo proprio uno
focused
staff che
exclusively
lavoravamo
on
su
this.
questo, cioè
Just
come
as there
esisteva lo
was a
staff di
costume
costumi,
crew,
esisteva lo
there
staff
was
di
an acting
acting
crew.
che
They
lavorava per
broke down the
scomporre le
scenes and the
scene in
book
libro
into narrative
in,
bits and made sure not
in
only that the
interpretazioni
characters had a narrative
facendo in
arc
modo
from
che non
episode 1
solo
to the
i
finale,
personaggi avessero un
but
arco
also that
ogni
they
scena
experienced
la
change,
prima
an
puntata,
evolution that
la
was
scena della prima
coherent,
puntata avesse
that was
questi
fully
cambiamenti,
represented by
ma
the
fossero dei
actors, and that the
cambiamenti
actors kept in
coerenti
mind at all
e che
times.
venissero espressi
Every
in modo
time they
che
performed the scene, the
fossero
actors were aware
presenti
not only of
dall'inizio
the
durante
text,
ogni
but
scena e
above
soprattutto
all
poi sul
of the
sottotesto.
subtext.
Cioè
They
loro
knew
ogni volta che
precisely
recitavano
where they
sapevano
were
qual
in the
era il
narrative
testo,
arc of the
qual era il
character.
sottotesto
Professional
e a che
actors
punto della
do this all the
storia
time,
erano.
but the
E
two
questo un
young
attore
protagonists didn't have the experience
professionista
of
lo fa
such
già
in-depth
per conto
character
suo,
work.
invece le
And then there was
ragazze non
also the
avevano
more trivial
come
problem
dire,
that the characters
l'esperienza
are slightly
di
older than
aggrapparsi,
Gaia
di
and Margherita,
agganciarsi a questo tipo di
25, 26 years
lavoro
old,
così
already
approfondito.
mothers,
E poi c'è
which is
stato anche un
something
problema
very
di
far from their
switch
lived
banale,
experience
cioè
today.
loro rappresentavano
It was normal at the time to have a child at 18 or 20. It was common. Women had to adapt to this very quickly. Today, life for women in Italy is very different. So we had to explore, how do you hold a child? How do you take care of a home? How do you behave in a marriage? And of course, we had to zoom in on the historical context. How did people talk about ideas or ideology at the time? What is the meaning of some of the things these characters are saying? Sometimes I had to give a short lecture to 15 young actors and explain to them what the word feminism or the word fascism meant, or what a union is. Today we take for granted that everyone knows these things, especially people in my generation, but an 18-year-old doesn't necessarily know, and therefore we had to explain to them exactly what passing out flyers meant, or what a duplicator was, how a union worked, because this is the historical context of the series. It was funny because in the first few days I didn't realize just how much they didn't know. Sometimes I would ask, "Do you understand this line?" And they'd say, "No, I don't understand this word." It was always a word whose meaning I took for granted. So I would become a professor of contemporary history, explaining what it meant, for instance, for a young woman to stand on a stage and defend women's rights. I would explain things like this constantly to the crew and to the actors. The only people who knew what I meant were the older extras.
The late 60s and 70s was such a vivid time, and these decades, well, they still live in our imaginations and our contemporary culture. But I think somehow we don't always get it right when we tell the story of those years.
Sbagliamo nel raccontare di quel tempo solamente la sua degenerazione.
Maybe something we got wrong in talking about that period is that we focus only on how it degenerated. Whenever we talk about the politics of those years, we talk about terrorism, we talk about the catastrophic end of ideologies. Instead, I think it's been important to have spent at least a decade asking ourselves difficult questions about ethics, politics, about relations between the sexes, the management of public affairs, the public administration, the role of the state. It's been an important decade. Instead of always focusing on the degeneration of this debate that led to terrorism, we should recognize that those debates were healthy, that it was right to consider those fundamental questions. Instead, the rise of terrorism and then the 1980s put an end to all of that, to both the good and the bad of those years. I wish we could recover from that time the capacity we had for patience. It's amazing to consider how patient we were, patient enough to sit through a political meeting and listen to everyone speak, patient enough to read books that set out monumental ideologies that today we would find indecipherable. We were reading obscure writers, watching obscure movies, simply because we had patience, and we knew that from that patience something good would come. I have to say, this is something you never hear when we talk about that time, but those years were years of patience.
I read somewhere that in filming this third season of My Brilliant Friend, you were inspired stylistically by the films of John Cassavetes, a director that I adore. Can you tell me a little bit more about this connection?
I was inspired by his process. I didn't want to copy a specific style, which is impossible. Instead, I tried to follow a process that consists in working with the actors, as we've already described, to study the characters in depth, to explore them, put the actors in the condition to first perform a scene in front of the camera, and then have the opportunity to explore different aspects of that scene. Later, I would change the way I directed the scene to see if all the possibilities have been explored. It's a bit like jazz. I told the actors, don't act the lines, act what's in between the lines, act the thoughts, say the lines but act the thoughts. This was a widespread practice in those years, thanks to the influence of the Actors Studio, when cinema interrogated the actors and their work. I've also moved very freely with the camera, using a handheld camera, trying to give the impression that the camera was not, so to speak, waiting for the actors, but actively following them, trying to capture their expressions, because sometimes things would come together in the very first take. Sometimes we have included the first take in the series, or at least the first good take, not the third or the fourth or the fifth, but the one in which the scene was performed with the freshness of the first time.
What about this third season do you think American viewers or viewers outside of Italy will find most surprising?
Surely, viewers will be surprised by the political context, because not many countries have been pervaded by such intense political passion as Italy was in those years. That passion was everywhere. It entered families, it entered homes. In the 70s, I was in high school, and the first thing you asked a girl you met was, "Who are you with? Which party, which side are you on?" Which I believe doesn't happen anymore anywhere in the world. Another surprising element, for example, will be the depiction of historic downtowns. The fact that historic centers of Italian cities were still a place where normal people lived. We will see Elena living in the historic center of Florence. More often, we'll see the historic center of Naples. Both the upper and middle class and working class lived in these old neighborhoods next to one another, which in my opinion is especially interesting in the case of Florence. Elena now belongs to the upper class, but at the time, the historic center of Florence was not just for tourists. It was a place where everyday life happened. Also, there's the fact I took a lot of the series outdoors. I avoided shooting in studio and shot on location as much as possible, so that the viewer could feel the cities. The series moves fast towards the present, and the closer we get to today, the more color becomes a protagonist. I also tried to work a lot on fabrics and set design, on the color of walls, because these were the years in which color began to live inside the home. So instead of the sort of black and white or different shades of grey that Saverio Costanzo rightly used trying to evoke the 1950s and 60s, in season 3 there's an explosion of color, even if we could say that the season is more dramatic, darker, more lonely, even more desperate. But the colors are the colors of those years. People and women dressed in bright colors that express their sexuality, revealed their bodies. We will see Elena wearing for the first time tight clothes, cut to enhance her femininity, as well as men wearing very tight clothes that show their bodies. And this is something that was typical of those years and that surprised me as a child, that I wanted to reproduce. We say attilato in Italian, tight-fitting, which means clothes that trace the lines of your body, of your skin. This is an element that was common all over the world at the time, but which was extremely evident in Italy.
When we look back at 4 seasons of My Brilliant Friend, what do you think people will recognize as Daniele Luchetti's signature contribution to the series?
I don't know. I really think I was chosen precisely because I had already done some work in movies about the 1970s, and because I know that period well. Maybe I hope that this aspect will show and remain. I also hope that the episodes that explored the political themes will be compelling and have a lasting impact, because such themes are very difficult to understand for those who didn't live through them. I hope I was able to tell that larger story in a universal way. In doing so, I was certainly helped by the fact that this broader universal story is always told through the humanity and the imperfections of the characters of Elena and Lila.
Daniele Luchetti, thank you very much. Ciao, grazie.
Grazie a te Michael, davvero. Buon lavoro e buon tutto. Speriamo che vada bene. Ciao, arrivederci. Ciao.